In the spring of 1888, a black carriage creaked up the gravel path toward the cloister of the Sacred Heart. It was still early. The fog lay heavy across the pines, unmoving, as if time itself had settled into the stones of the hillside. Three girls stepped out. Their gloves were white, their crosses silver, their dresses pressed with a stiffness only wealth could afford. Their last name was Hale. And in 2 weeks, not one of them would exist in any official record again. No farewell letter, no footprints, no remains, only a journal, hidden beneath a cracked floorboard with 5 handwritten words. "We never opened that door." The eldest, Margaret, stepped forward first. Her posture was taut, chin high like her grandfather had taught her. She carried a single brown case, monogrammed. Behind her followed Isabella Nervous, quieter, and then Clara, the youngest, holding a ragged stuffed bear whose button eyes had been torn off long ago. She clutched it, not like a child with a toy, but like someone holding onto a memory that had already started to fade. A nun waited at the threshold. No name, no smile, just a curt nod and a voice that cracked like frost. "You're expected." The building loomed above them, 4 stories of ash-gray stone, narrow windows like arrow slits, and a single bell tower that cast its shadow across the entryway. The crucifix above the arched door hung crooked, rust trailing like dried blood along the nails. It pointed east, ever so slightly, as if warning them away. Inside, the walls were silent, thick with damp. The air carried no candle smoke, no warmth. The girls were led down a long hallway, past sealed doors and faded portraits. Their room 4 sat at the far end of the east wing. 3 beds, 1 freshly made, 2 with wrinkles that didn't belong to them. Margaret noticed. She opened her mouth. The nun was faster. "Girls come and go," she said, some without a sound. She left the room without waiting for a reply. The windows were barred. The crucifixes above each bed were carved from dark wood, polished smooth at the edges, as if gripped too tightly for too long. On the nightstand, someone had left a wooden rosary and a single iron key. No tag, no note. That night, they prayed. They whispered a psalm. Margaret read aloud a passage their mother had marked in the Bible years ago. Outside, the fog pressed harder against the glass. And long after the candles had been snuffed, Clara sat awake, eyes open in the dark, her bear clutched to her chest, listening. Somewhere in the south wing, a bell rang once, and then again. No one else stirred. They found the package after supper, sitting neatly on Margaret's bed, as if it had always been there. No knock, no footsteps, no voice to announce its arrival. Just a plain box wrapped in dark green paper and tied with a red cord that smelled faintly of cedar and ink. Margaret touched it first. The wrapping gave easily beneath her fingers, revealing a small wooden case-polished mahogany, the initials EH carved into the lid in a style she knew all too well. Her grandfather's hand. She ran a thumb over it once before opening the clasp. Inside, nestled in a bed of black velvet, lay a single locket, gold, heavy, the kind worn not for beauty but for significance. Etched into its surface was a serpent devouring its own tail, delicate, looping, almost elegant. Clara leaned in to look, but drew back quickly. "It's watching," she whispered. Isabel rolled her eyes, but said nothing. Margaret held the locket up to the candlelight. It swung on its chain like a pendulum, casting flickers across the ceiling. There was something unsettling about its weight, about the way the serpent seemed to shift if you stared too long. She pressed the latch. It didn't open. On the underside was a second hinge, smaller, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. Margaret pressed again. This time, the locket clicked open, not like a jewelry box, but like a door. Inside was no photo, no lock of hair, just a circle of glass, blackened and cracked, and beneath it, etched into the gold, "To see what others deny." Isabel took a step back. Why would he send us that? Margaret didn't answer. She remembered his words on the carriage steps. 3 girls leave. 3 women return. In God's name. And the strange way he'd held onto her hand for too long, looking not at her but past her, as if something stood just behind her shoulder, waiting. She closed the locket. It snapped shut with a sharp, metallic click. There was no note, no letter from him, no instruction, just the object left in silence. Margaret placed it back into the velvet and shut the box, but her fingers lingered on the lid. That serpent's shape was burned now into her thoughts, coiled and endless. Later that night, after the candles had gone out, she thought she heard something shift inside her suitcase. A scraping, a soft mechanical whir, like something winding itself from within. She sat up. The chapel was colder than their rooms, and nearly twice as silent. Rows of girls in identical gray habits sat motionless in the pews, hands folded, heads bowed not in prayer, but in something closer to stillness. The kind of stillness that didn't end when the priest stopped speaking. Margaret, Isabel, and Clara stood at the back, unsure if they were meant to join or watch. No one turned to greet them. No one whispered. Even the nuns who patrolled the aisles moved with a soft, mechanical precision, as if sound had been trained out of them. At the far end, behind the altar, hung a wooden crucifix nearly as tall as the wall. Unlike the delicate ones, they wore around their necks gifts from Grandfather Hellethus. One was warped and dark with age. The Christ figure carved into it had no eyes, only smooth hollows where they should have been. When the service ended, the girls filed out in perfect silence. A bell rang once. That was the only signal to move. In the dining hall, they sat by assigned numbers. Clara was placed at a table with 4 girls who said nothing to her. Not a word. Margaret watched as her sister tried to smile, to offer a polite hello. One girl turned her head away. The others simply looked down at their bowls. That afternoon, during needlework, Isabel tried to speak to a girl beside her. She didn't get far. The girl looked at her silver crucifix, blinked once, and then changed seats without saying a word. Isabel didn't finish her thread work. She stared at the half-done rose in her lap and never picked up the needle again. Back in their quarters, Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, her crucifix hanging loosely from her neck. She turned it over in her fingers, feeling its cool weight. The chain was thinner than it had been yesterday. Or maybe it just felt that way. "I think they mean something," she said aloud, not to anyone in particular. Clara was playing with the hem of her blanket. Isabel stood by the window, watching nothing. "I saw another girl," Margaret continued, "during chapel. Her crucifix wasn't silver, it was wood. The others wore the same." "So?" Isabel didn't turn around. "So we're different. They know it. Maybe they hate it." "They hate us," Isabel said. "That's all." That night, just before the lights were extinguished, Isabel slipped her crucifix off her neck and placed it inside the drawer of her nightstand. She didn't say why. No one asked. The room felt colder once she did. At breakfast the next morning, the seat beside Isabel was empty, not just unoccupied, gone, as if it had never been there. The chair, the dish, the spoon, all gone. And when she looked around the hall, none of the other girls wore silver anymore. The garden sat behind the east wing, enclosed by a crumbling stone wall wrapped in dead ivy. By day, it looked like a forgotten courtyard, a few withering rose bushes, a weathered bench, soil too dry to grow anything but weeds. But by night, it changed. That evening, the air refused to settle. The fog had lifted, but something else hung in its place. Something sharper, thinner, like a silence stretched too tight. From their window, Clara stared down at the garden and whispered, "Someone's moving out there." Margaret looked, but saw nothing, only shadows and vines. Later, just before the bell tolled for final prayers, Isabel suggested they go outside. Not far, just for air. The sisters hadn't allowed it, but no one was watching. The hallway was dark, the cloister hushed, and the night unusually warm for October. They slipped out barefoot, their robes brushing against the stone as they crept down the side path. The door to the garden was half rotted, but unlocked. Margaret pushed it open, and the hinges groaned, too loud in the quiet. The moon was full, but the garden felt dim. The walls that surrounded it were too high, too close. Ivy hung like veins, dry and blackened. The air smelled like iron. They didn't speak. Not until Clara stopped mid-step and turned toward the far wall. Her face had gone pale. "Did you hear that?" Margaret listened. At first, nothing. Then yes, a voice, but not a full voice. Just the shape of one, a breath forming syllables it never quite committed to. It was coming from behind the wall. Close, almost touching. They froze. It whispered again. Not loud, not urgent, just deliberate. Like someone reading from a very old book in the wrong tongue. Isabel moved toward the sound. Margaret grabbed her arm. "Don't," she said. Isabel pulled free. "It's just one of the girls," she insisted. "Maybe they come out here at night. Maybe that's why they hate us." But the whisper didn't come from above or across. It came from low beneath the wall, as if the stone itself had lungs. Then the wind shifted. The roses rattled. The whispers stopped. They ran. Back through the rotted gate. Back down the corridor. Bare feet slapping against cold tile. They didn't stop until they reached their room and slammed the door shut. No one mentioned the garden at breakfast. The girls around them continued as always, silent and inward. But Clara didn't touch her food. Isabel didn't wear her crucifix. And Margaret noticed a stain on her nightgown. She couldn't explain a gray streak across the hem, like ash from a fire that hadn't burned in years. That night, the sisters nailed the garden door shut. No announcement, no warning, just the sound of hammers behind stone walls. And from that point on, the garden was no longer mentioned, not even in whispers. Sister Agnes had eyes like polished slatedol at first glance, but sharp enough to cut if you lingered. She found them in the hallway after morning prayer, standing near the statue of St. Lucy, whose stone hands held two glass eyes on a plate. Margaret had only paused to look, tracing the cracks in the marble where the saint's feet met the floor, but Agnes appeared as if summoned. "You shouldn't be here," she said, not angry, just final. "We were only walking," Margaret replied. "There are places in this cloister that do not welcome feet," said Agnes, "even curious ones." She turned and walked, expecting them to follow. They obeyed. Her heels tapped in perfect rhythm down the main hall, the echo bouncing back as if the walls were listening. She led them to a narrow corridor they hadn't seen before. The light was dimmer here, the lamps unlit. At the far end stood a black door, heavy wood bound in iron, a rusted chain wrapped across the handle, secured with a thick padlock the size of a fist. "That wing is closed," Agnes said without looking at them. "You will not enter it. You will not speak of it. Do you understand?" Clara moved closer to Margaret, small fingers twisting in the hem of her sleeve. "What's behind it?" Isabel asked. Agnes finally turned. Her expression didn't change, but something in her face tightened, like a string pulled too far. "Dust," she said, "and grief." They walked back in silence. Agnes said nothing more, and the girls did not ask. That afternoon, while the others were in scripture study, Margaret claimed she had forgotten her notebook and excused herself. She walked quickly through the corridors, counting the turns, remembering the junction. It was there just as she'd left it, and the door, too, still chained, still locked. She stepped closer. The marble beneath her feet was uneven, chipped in patches, as if heavy things had been dragged across it. The walls bore faint discolorations, long vertical lines like smudges where furniture or hands had leaned too long, and carved into the doorframe, just above the handle, was a symbol barely visible under the dust. A serpent in a circle, the same as on the locket. She didn't touch the door, not yet. She only leaned in, ear close to the wood. Something moved. Not loudly, not urgently, but something shifted behind it. A shuffle, a breath, a presence. She stepped back. By the time she returned to scripture study, the nun overseeing the room didn't look up. Isabel glanced at her, but said nothing. That night, as the lamps dimmed, Margaret checked her nightstand. The locket sat where she had left it. Only now, it was warm, warmer than it should have been, and the clasp had come undone. The bell rang once, just after midnight. Then again, slower, heavier. Margaret sat up straight in bed, heart knocking hard against her ribs. It wasn't the chapel bell. That one had a clearer tone, brighter, familiar. This sound came from deeper in the building, as if struck by an unsteady hand, too far underground to echo properly. She looked across the room. Isabel was sitting up as well, eyes wide, lips parted. Clara remained curled beneath her blanket, motionless except for the way her fingers twitched against the sheets. A third ring came, dull and distant, then silence. Margaret whispered, "You heard that too?" Isabel nodded. "From the south wing." No one moved. The stillness returned too quickly, like the sound had been swallowed. In the morning, Margaret asked about it. She waited until Sister Agnes walked past their table in the dining hall and raised her voice just enough to be heard. "There was a bell last night," she said. "It woke us." Agnes paused, spoon still in her hand. "There are no bells rung after dusk," she said without turning. "Perhaps you were dreaming." "We all heard it." "Then you dreamed together." Later, in the library, Isabel found a sketch of the cloister's original layout. It was buried in a ledger from decades earlier, hand-drawn in ink that had browned at the edges. She traced the lines with her fingertip. The south wing had once held sleeping quarters, an infirmary, and what was labeled simply, "Bell Room Internal." She turned the page, but the next diagram had no bell room at all. That night, no bells sounded. The cloister was still. The hall outside their door remained dark. The crucifixes hung motionless. Margaret tried to sleep, but kept her eyes open, counting the seconds between the creaks of the building. When she finally closed them, she dreamed of rope-thick, wet rope being pulled upward, hand over hand, over and over, but never reaching the bell. She woke to find Isabel gone. The blankets were folded back, the bed still warm. Margaret got up quickly, checking the hallway. Empty, no candlelight, just that low buzz of silence the cloister wore like a veil. She found her sister standing at the end of the corridor, facing the wall, barefoot, still as stone. "Isabel," she whispered. No response. She approached slowly. Isabel's lips were moving, soundless. Her eyes were open, but unfocused, turned towards something far past the stone. Margaret reached for her hand. It was cold. When she touched her shoulder, Isabel flinched violently and gasped, as if pulled out of water. Back in the room, Isabel claimed she remembered nothing. "I was asleep," she said, clutching the blanket with trembling hands. "I swear." But in the morning, her feet were black with dust, and beneath her pillow lay an iron bell clapper, rusted through. They were told they could write once a week. Sister Miriam brought the paper thin and gray, lined faintly in blue, and set it on the table like it might bruise if touched too hard. She placed a single quill beside it, one bottle of ink, and nothing else. Margaret wrote first. To Grandfather Hale, careful, respectful, just as he'd taught her. She mentioned the chapel, the garden, the silence. She did not mention the south wing, or the locket, or the bell. Isabel wrote too, though hers was shorter. She asked about the house in Boston, whether the servants had kept the piano tuned, whether anyone had fed the horses. Clara only drew a pictura crooked cross, a figure with no face, a bird in a cage with its wings folded shut. They sealed the letters with wax provided by the nuns, a milky gray lump pressed flat with a blank iron ring. No insignia, no warmth, just weight. Margaret watched as Sister Miriam collected the letters without speaking and slid them into a black leather pouch. She never saw them again. The next week they wrote again. No reply came. On the third week, Margaret wrote a different kind of letter, this time to their mother. She kept it simple, but beneath her careful sentences, she laced questions. Are you well? Have you heard from grandfather? Do you remember the locket you gave me when I turned 15? She folded it with hands that shook and sealed it with too much wax. Isabel didn't write that week. She just sat at the table, staring at the ink like it might accuse her of something. Clara drew again, this time just a door. On Friday, Sister Miriam returned with a parcel wrapped in cloth. It was laid on Margaret's bed without a word. No name, no note, just the parcel. Inside were 3 envelopes. The paper was the same gray, the wax the same dull stamp, but one of them had already been opened, torn unevenly across the top. Margaret unfolded it. It was hers, the letter to her mother, but the ink was darker now, and the handwriting no longer hers. Someone had rewritten it, copied the words, but altered the tone. Where she had asked questions, there were now reassurances. Where she had expressed worry, there was obedience. At the bottom, a signature, Margaret Hale, written in a hand that didn't curve the G the way she always had. She looked up. No one else had received mail. That night, she sat awake, holding the letter by candlelight. She read it 3 times, then held it to the flame. The paper curled slowly, almost reluctantly, as if it wanted to be remembered. Outside, the wind pushed against the windows like it was trying to speak, but no sound came. And in the morning, the mailbox on the chapel wall had vanished. No one noticed at first. Margaret still moved through the corridors, attended the morning rites, bowed her head at the right moments. But she no longer spoke. Not to the nuns, not to Clara. Not even to Isabel, who tried more than once to draw her out with a joke or a question, her voice brittle with effort. Sister Agnes called it devotion. Some girls choose silence, she said. An offering, a form of fasting. She'll speak again when her soul is ready. But Clara knew better. Margaret hadn't chosen silence. It had taken her. On the 3rd night of the 3rd week, Clara woke to find Margaret kneeling beside her own bed. Her hands were folded, but her eyes were open, staring not at the crucifix above the headboard, but past it. Past the wall. Past everything. The candle by her bed had gone out. In the morning, she still hadn't moved. When the sisters brought breakfast, they placed her tray gently on the nightstand, as if afraid to wake her from whatever she had sunk into. Isabel sat beside her and whispered, "You're scaring Clara." Margaret didn't blink. Later that day, Isabel found a bloodied handkerchief in the waste bin, not fresh, dried, folded neatly, as if saved from something that hadn't yet ended. The corners were embroidered with the initials E.H. Isabel didn't mention it. Margaret carried her journal with her, tucked beneath one arm. Occasionally, she would take it out during chapel or in the garden and flip to the last page, but no one saw her write anymore. That evening, while the other girls recited scripture in soft, synchronized voices, Margaret stared at her reflection in the library's cracked mirror. The fracture ran across her face like a fault line, splitting her mouth from her eyes. She traced it with her fingertip, and for a brief moment her lips moved not in speech, but in echo. She went to her bed early that night. Clara placed the bear beside her and tucked the blanket close, like she used to when they were children. Isabel lit the candle, but Margaret blew it out before anyone could speak. The room felt heavier once the light was gone. At midnight, Clara woke to the sound of pages turning. She sat up slowly and saw Margaret at her desk, the journal open before her. The moonlight made her look pale and hollow, her shoulders hunched like she was shrinking into herself. Clara didn't speak, she only watched. Margaret's hand moved once. The quill scratched the page, then stopped. In the morning, the journal was still open. Ink dried mid-sentence. The last word written, returning, unfinished, no period. The room smelled faintly of wax and iron. The mirror was shattered completely, and Margaret did not rise. The knock came just after vespers, one slow, deliberate sound, as if whoever stood behind the door wasn't asking to be let in, only waiting to be acknowledged. The sisters paused. Even the air seemed to pause. No visitors were expected. No carriages had arrived. No one from the outside world had stepped onto the cloister grounds in weeks. Clara heard it from the hallway as she carried her candle past the parlor. Another knock, softer this time. She hesitated, looked toward the others. No one moved. The parlor door stood slightly ajar, the crack just wide enough to let the candlelight flicker against the dark wood of the entry door beyond it. She stepped in. The hearth was cold, ash untouched. No fire had burned there in days. She reached the door and laid a hand against the knob. It turned beneath her palm-leisurely, without resistance. Behind it stood a man. He wore a coat too fine for a priest, too dark for a mourner. His gloves were black leather, fingers too long, too thin. His face, Clara would never be able to describe it fully, not afterward. She would say later that his features were correct, symmetrical even, but felt borrowed, like a mask copied from memory. "Is Margaret home?" he asked. His voice was smooth, without warmth. Not familiar, not strange, just wrong. Clara's grip on the candle faltered. Wax spilled onto her fingers, but she didn't flinch. "She's not well," she said. The man smiled, but not with his eyes. "I brought something she left behind." He held out his hand, and in it lay a small brass hair comb with 3 missing teeth. Clara recognized it instantly. Margaret had lost it before they ever arrived. "Who are you?" He didn't answer. He simply nodded once, turned and walked into the darkness without a sound. The fog swallowed him. Clara shut the door and turned the bolt, but it was already locked. She hadn't noticed unlocking it. Behind her, the parlor stood silent. The candle in her hand had gone out. The air inside the room had turned colder, heavier. She crossed the space quickly, holding the comb tight in her palm, not even noticing when the broken teeth bit into her skin. She didn't tell the sisters. She didn't tell Isabel. When she returned to their room, Margaret was still lying motionless in bed. Isabel had drifted into shallow sleep, muttering in her dreams. Clara sat at the desk and opened the journal Margaret had left untouched. She placed the comb inside it, like a bookmark. The next morning, her fingers were wrapped in bandages. She said she'd burned them on a candle, but no one believed her. Not really. She didn't speak during breakfast, and she never asked who the man was again. She appeared without announcement during morning lessons, slipping into the chapel like smoke. Her veil was longer than the others, hanging to her waist, stitched along the edges with uneven black thread. Her movements were slower, more deliberate, as if every step cost something. The room shifted subtly when she entered. Even the air seemed to recede. Clara noticed her hands first, wrapped entirely in white linen, yellowed with age and stained in places that looked too dark to be ink. The bandages were thick, layered, and tied with surgical knots. She didn't use them not to carry books, not to lift her robes, not to gesture. She simply let them rest against her sides, like they had been forgotten by the rest of her body. When she passed Margaret's row, she paused. The two didn't look at each other, but Margaret blinked for the first time in hours. Later, in the hallway, Clara asked Sister Miriam who the new nun was. Miriam frowned. "There is no new sister." "But she—" "There is no new sister." She said it again, slower, final. That evening, as the girls returned from the library, they passed the long hallway leading toward the infirmary. A sliver of light spilled across the floor from an open door at the far end. From inside came the soft drag of bandaged feet and the faint clink of glass on porcelain. Isabel slowed. "She's in there." "No," Clara said. "She's not." But Margaret turned. For the first time in days, she moved on her own. She stepped toward the hallway, steady, purposeful. The door at the end began to close before she could reach it. Clara caught up just as it clicked shut. Behind them, Sister Agnes's voice cut through the corridor like a blade. She was warned. They turned. Agnes stood in shadow, her arms folded, eyes unreadable. "Who was?" Isabel asked. Agnes didn't answer immediately. She looked past them, toward the closed infirmary door, then to Margaret. "There were others," she said finally. "3 winters ago, before the frost that split the chapel wall, girls like you, not Hale girls, but still sent here, from families with names." "What happened to them?" Clara asked. Agnes's jaw tensed. "One of them looked into the well." She said it like a prayer, or a curse. "What well?" Isabel asked. But Agnes had already turned and walked away. That night, Clara dreamed of smoke rising through floorboards, of fingers trying to hold a rosary too long in the fire, of a girl kneeling by a stone well with a mirror instead of water at the bottom. When she woke, there was ash on the windowsill, and a trail of black footprints leading down the hallway, stopping just before Margaret's door. He came just after sunrise, dragging a warped wooden cart behind him. The wheels creaked, leaving faint ruts in the gravel as he made his way toward the south edge of the property, where the trees grew denser and the frost never fully lifted. The groundskeeper had no name the girls knew. They simply called him Mr. Gray, though no one recalled if he'd ever spoken a word aloud. That morning he had a task. The well sat behind the old shed, half buried in ivy and flanked by thorn bushes no one trimmed. The stones around its base were cracked, the bucket rotted through, the pulley rusted stiff. Still, Gray brought his tools, a coil of rope, a rusted hook. The sisters hadn't told him what to find, only to look. It took 3 hours to lower the hook and pull it back. Nothing. A 4th hour passed. On the 5th, the rope jerked once, then again. He leaned over the edge and winched it up slowly, the wood of the crank groaning beneath his weight. The first thing that surfaced was the rosary. Black beads, slick with moisture, the crucifix missing, the string snapped halfway through. He placed it gently in a cloth-lined tray. Next came the doll fragments. Porcelain face shattered at the temple, one glass eye still intact, burn marks along the edge of its scalp where hair should have been. Gray turned it over once before setting it beside the rosary. Then, with one final tug, the rope went limp. He pulled the final object free. It was small, round, metal, twisted slightly at the hinge, a locket. Inside, the inscription was still legible, to see what others deny. But the glass was cracked, and a tooth small, white, unmistakably human had been wedged behind it. He didn't take the tray to the main hall. He didn't go to the sisters. Instead, he left it outside the door to the chapel and vanished before the breakfast bell rang. Margaret found it first. She said nothing, just stood over the tray, her face blank, her hands tucked inside her sleeves. Clara joined her moments later and froze when she saw the locket. "That's yours," she whispered. Margaret didn't reply. She reached down and picked it up. The metal was wet, but warm, unnaturally warm. By the time Isabel arrived, the tray was empty. Only a faint line of condensation remained on the wood, and a single drop of something dark clung to the edge, too thick for water, too bright for ink. That night, Margaret wore the locket to bed. And sometime after the candles had been blown out, she began to whisper in her sleep, a sound without shape, low, repetitive, as if reciting a prayer that none of them had ever been taught. The chapel had never looked more radiant. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows in fractured shafts of red and gold, dust drifting in the beams like ash suspended in honey. The pews were full. Every girl, every nun, even Margaret had taken her place, seated between Clara and Isabel, her face serene and unreadable beneath the soft veil of candle smoke. It was the final Mass of the month, a high Mass they called it, sacred, binding. The sisters wore cream-colored vestments stitched with gold thread that caught the light as they moved. Incense swung from silver thuribles, tracing loops through the air that left the scent of burnt myrrh clinging to the stone. Margaret didn't blink during the readings. Clara mouthed the prayers but spoke none aloud. Isabel stared at the altar so intently her eyes watered. None of them reached for each other's hands. None of them moved. The hymn began midway through the second reading, a simple melody, but the lyrics repeated again and again. "Take this flesh and be unbroken. Take this blood and do not wake." Over and over, soft and low, like the chapel was humming to itself. The priest raised the chalice. Margaret stood first. Clara and Isabel followed. They approached the altar with practiced grace, heads bowed, hands cupped. The priest placed the host on each tongue with ceremonial stillness. They accepted it without hesitation. Margaret's wafer bled. It was a single drop, thin, red, vanishing into her mouth so quickly it might have been imagined. But Clara flinched when it happened, and Isabel turned her head as if the light had suddenly changed. The priest continued as though nothing had occurred. When the girls returned to their seats, something had shifted. Margaret's eyes were glassy, like a film had settled over them. Clara's hands trembled in her lap. Isabel bit her lip until it bled and didn't seem to notice. The hymn ended. The service concluded. And the chapel emptied. Except the girls never returned to their quarters. By the time the bells rang for midday meal, they had not been seen. Their beds were untouched, their shoes still aligned beneath them. The journal remained open on Margaret's desk. The locket hung from the bedpost, swinging slowly as though someone had only just let go. The sisters searched the grounds, quietly, efficiently. No questions were asked aloud. By evening, their names had been removed from the duty chart. By nightfall, their belongings were gone. And at dawn the next morning, a new hymn began echoing through the halls. No one had heard it before. No one claimed to be singing it. But the lyrics were familiar. Take this flesh and be unbroken. Take this blood and do not wake. The corridor was colder than the rest of the cloister. Even the air tasted wrong, dry and metallic, like the breath left behind in a closed tomb. The torches lining the walls had burned out long ago, leaving only the faint light from Clara's trembling candle to guide them. No one spoke. Margaret walked first, her feet silent against the cracked tile, the locket swinging from her neck with each step like a pendulum counting down. Clara followed close, her eyes fixed on the shadows ahead, while Isabel brought up the rear, clutching her hands into fists so tight her nails left crescents in her palms. They passed door after door, wooden, warped, some slightly ajar, others sealed with rusted hinges, but none were the door. They knew which one it would be. It waited at the very end of the corridor, taller than the others, darker. There was no keyhole, no handle, only a small round iron plate embedded at chest height. The air around it shimmered slightly, as if something behind the door breathed. Margaret stepped toward it. The candle flickered wildly, and for a moment, the light revealed what lay beneath the Dora chain. Black iron, worn smooth. It coiled like a root into the crack between the floor and the threshold, disappearing into the room beyond. Clara reached out to stop her. Margaret didn't hesitate. She touched the plate. A deep, grinding sound echoed through the stone, though ancient. The chain beneath the door jerked once, then began to slither inward, link by link, pulled from within by something unseen. It scraped along the tile like bones dragged across marble. The door opened. No force, no creak. It simply unlatched and swung open on its own, revealing a room shrouded in wet darkness. The walls inside were lined with mirrors, dozens of them, each one fractured at the corners, angled toward a central figure in the room, a single chair facing away. Its surface gleamed slightly, as if covered in something damp. The air changed, colder, each girl's breath now visible in the dark. Then the voice came. Not a whisper, not a scream, just a single word, spoken with perfect clarity from inside the room. Closer. Isabel stepped back. Clara grabbed her arm. No, she said, don't. But Isabel was already moving, drawn forward like something had caught her just behind the eyes. She crossed the threshold without resistance, her face blank, her steps slow. She reached the chair. She placed a hand on its back. And then she screamed. It was sharp, sudden, and utterly human, but it ended too quickly, cut off, not faded, like a candle snuffed between fingers. Clara lunged forward, but the door slammed shut before she could reach it. The iron plate glowed faintly, pulsing once, then went dark. Inside, there was only silence. No scream, no echo. No, Isabel. The morning light was thin and gray, barely reaching the edges of the dormitory walls. Frost clung to the inside of the windows, delicate and unmoving, as if the air itself had frozen overnight. The room was silent. No footsteps, no rustling bed sheets, no breath. All 3 beds were made. Perfectly made, tighter than any of the girls ever managed. The pillows were smoothed, the blankets tucked in crisp hospital corners, but none of them were there. Clara's slippers sat neatly beneath her frame, soles clean, untouched. Margaret's crucifix lay beside her pillow, chain folded in a deliberate curve. Isabel's rosary hung from the bedpost, one bead missing. The window at the end of the room was open an inch. The frost hadn't reached it. A wind moved through, barely enough to stir the curtains, but the cold it brought felt wrong. Not winter's chill. Something older, hollowed out. On Margaret's desk sat the journal. It was closed. The ribbon marked a page halfway through. The ink bottle was missing its cap. A quill lay snapped beside it, split clean down the middle, as if someone had tried to write and couldn't. Sister Agnes stood in the doorway for a long time before stepping inside. She crossed the room slowly, passing each bed without touching anything. Her veil trailed softly behind her, gathering dust. She stopped at the desk, opened the journal, and read the final entry. It was just 5 words, written in black ink, faintly smudged. We never opened that door. No date, no signature. She closed the book, slid it back into the drawer, and turned to leave. By noon, the beds had been stripped, the slippers removed, the personal effects locked away. The other girls never asked. But at Vespers, a new hymn was introduced. Soft, wordless, a low hum that moved in slow waves, barely musical. The priest didn't mention it, the sisters didn't teach it. It simply began, as if everyone already knew how it went. That night, a storm gathered over the hills. The wind howled low across the cloister's stone face. The windows rattled, and the crucifix in the hallway fell from its nail. No one picked it up. The journal was moved to the archives the next day. filed beneath unreturned students' misc. And in the silence that followed, something behind the south wing door shifted again just once. A breath, or the memory of one. He arrived without warning, carriage wheels crunching over the gravel just after dawn. The horses steamed in the morning cold, flanks trembling with exhaustion. The driver said nothing as Grandfather Hale stepped out, coat buttoned to the throat, gloves creased, eyes hard beneath the brim of his hat. His monocle was gone. In its place, a reddened circle around his left eye, as if something had pressed too tightly for too long. The sisters met him at the gates. Sister Agnes offered a quiet bow. He did not return it. "Where are my granddaughters?" he asked. Agnes didn't flinch. "Gone." "Gone where?" "They left us, as some girls do." Hale said nothing. His jaw worked, but no sound came out. He stepped past her, storming into the cloister with the determination of a man who'd built half the foundation himself. He passed the chapel without pause, brushed through corridors lined with portraits and candle stubs until he found their room. The beds were stripped, the window latched shut, the air inside stale with absence. On the desk, he found the envelope. It bore his name, but the seal was unbroken. No handwriting, no stamp, just his name, Edgar Hale, in faint ink pressed too neatly to have come from a human hand. He didn't open it. Instead, he looked for the journal, but it was gone. Archives, locked. Sister Miriam waited outside when he returned to the hallway. She held a small black book with a leather binding, the vow ledger. Inside were signatures years of theme each girl's name, and the date she accepted the rites of silence. He flipped the pages. Clara Hale, Isabel Hale, Margaret Hale. Their names had been signed in red ink, not black, not blue, red, as if they'd given something more than consent. "I never authorized their enrollment," Hale said, voice cracking. "I paid for a term of education, not damnation." Sister Miriam didn't respond. He returned to the chapel at dusk. The pews were empty, the altar stripped. A single candle burned at the front, the wax dripping in steady, unnatural rhythm. He walked the aisle slowly, knees aching, and stopped at the altar rail. On the floor, tucked beneath the cushion where Margaret had once knelt, lay the shattered lens of his monocle. It had been broken cleanly, no glass scattered, no frame bent. Just the lens, cracked through the center, as if it had seen something it wasn't meant to reflect. He picked it up. Behind him, the priest entered, robes rustling like dead leaves. He carried no Bible, only a satchel. Inside, an envelope thicker than the first, bound in twine, no name. "For your loss," the priest said. Hale stared at it. "I want the truth." The priest set the satchel down and left. Hale never opened either envelope. But when he returned to Boston 2 days later, he withdrew every remaining girl in his extended family from religious schooling, and he never again spoke of Margaret or Clara or Isabel, not even on his deathbed. The report was typed on thick, cream-colored stationery bearing the seal of the Diocese of Burlington. The ink was dark, the margins wide, the language surgical in its precision. It began, as such things do, with denial. Following a thorough internal review, the diocese finds no evidence of misconduct, misplacement, or malice regarding the absences of Margaret Hale, Clara Hale, and Isabel Hale. No mention of the South Wing. No mention of the bells. No mention of the locket, the comb, the clapper, or the scream. Each page laid out a carefully constructed lattice of timelines, statements from the sisters, inventory lists, and implied irresponsibility on the part of the girl's late guardian. One footnote referenced spiritual fatigue common in female students of sensitive constitution. Another simply read, "Unsubstantiated hysteria." Their names were printed once, then redacted on the next page. a black bar smothering Hale, like it had never existed. Several pages were missing, altogether skipped in the page numbers, but not acknowledged. The final addendum bore the signature of 5 men, 1 bishop, 3 advisors, and a notary. Their names faded slightly, where the ink hadn't fully dried before filing. The report was never released to the families, not even to the church's own records department in Boston. It was placed inside a locked drawer beneath the office of the Archbishop, and labeled simply, Case 1132 withdrawn. 1 month later, the bishop who'd signed his name first, Father M.F. Green, failed to appear for a scheduled confirmation in Bar. The diocese sent a letter to his residence. No reply. His quarters were found in perfect order. No signs of struggle, no broken lock, no blood. Just a sealed envelope on his desk. Inside, 1 page torn from the original report, the sentence, "We never opened that door," underlined 3 times in what appeared to be dried blood. There was no investigation. His disappearance was recorded as voluntary retreat, a sabbatical. The church issued no statement, and the page was reinserted typed, cleaner now, without the underline. In the archives beneath the chancery, the file still exists. Its folder is thinner than it should be. Several documents inside appear duplicated. Others look new, but bear dates from years before they were written. One archivist, new to the order, once tried to make a copy. The machine jammed. When they retrieved the sheet, the page came out blank except for the faint outline of 3 empty beds. She never tried again. The cloister itself burned 2 winters later. Lightning, they said, or faulty candles. Nothing survived but the iron bell, which rang once as the roof collapsed, then fell silent forever. The diocese never rebuilt. And no girl named Hale ever appeared in its records again.